Good afternoon, Professor Janet Wilson, distinguished participants and partakers. I take extreme pleasure in opening the Day 2, Week 2 of International Faculty Development Program on Emerging Trends in English Literature. The program aimed to traverse the socio-cultural and political fecundity of the new normal post-COVID world through the lens of English literature. I acknowledge the invaluable support of the Head of Department of Languages, Integral University, Dr. H.M. Arif Nadwi, Convener, Dr. Arina Nazneen, Coordinator, Integral Learning Initiative ILI, Mr. Arif Osmani, the Organizing Committee, and the notable participants for the effective functioning of this program. To recommence the investigation of emerging trends in English literature, today's session will appraise the transculturalism in the age of territorial unfixity of English literature. The phenomena of transculturality is understood as the formation of multifaceted, fluid identities resulting from diverse cultural encounters. It is now a reality for a significant part of the world's population due to the intensified volume and frequency of migration, information exchange through new channels of communication technology, and global economic interdependencies. To elucidate further on the implications of transculturalism, I request Dr. Amna Shamim, Assistant Professor, Department of Languages, Integral University, to invite our eminent speaker, Professor Janet Wilson, and set about today's grouping session. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Vanya. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Janet M. Wilson, in this 2-week International Faculty Development Program organized by the Department of Languages, Integral University, in collaboration with United Nations Academic Impact on Emerging Trends in English Literature. Janet M. Wilson is Emerita Professor of English and Postcolonial Studies at the University of Northampton and Visiting Professor of the Birmingham Institute of Media and English, Birmingham City University, UK. Her research focuses on the diaspora and postcolonial writing of the settler colonies of Australasia, as well as refugee writing, the global novel, transnationalism, and transculturalism. She has edited and co-edited a number of books and journals. Her recent co-edited works include The Diaspora Studies Reader, published by Routledge in 2017, Catherine Mansfield, New Directions, published in 2020, Catherine Mansfield, The Gift of Breath, a special issue of the Journal of New Zealand Literature, published in 2020, and with Om Prakash Trivedi and Christina M. Camus Fernandez, Planetary Precarity and the Pandemic, a special issue of the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, published in 2020. Professor Wilson has edited The General and the Nightingale, The War Stories of Dan Davin, published by Otago University Press in 2020. Her most recent article on New Zealand writers Janet Frame and Robin Hyde is published in Interventions, and forthcoming is a co-edited volume, Beyond Borders, New Zealand and the Globalization of Culture, to be published by Routledge. She is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Postcolonial Writing and the series Studies in World Literature, chair of Challenging Precarity, a Global Network, and was also the principal investigator of the AHRC-funded Diaspora Screen Media Network. In 2022-23, Professor Wilson is Fellow in Residence at the Rothermere American Institute, Oxford, UK. With sincere reverence, I would like to welcome Professor Janet M. Wilson to enlighten us by giving a transcultural reading of the novel The Man Who Would Not See.
Thank you. Thank you for that very warm introduction. And it is a great pleasure for me to be able to address your group today. I'm speaking from New Zealand, and it's just evening now. It feels like the end of the day, and I know that you're in the middle of yours. However, without any further ado, I'll start on my talk. I'm going to talk about Rajorshi Chakraborti's The Man Who Would Not See, published in 2018, as one of the very few novels to be written by an Indian migrant in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I've chosen this novel because it fictionalizes issues of migration and relocation that are particular to the present climate and can be mapped onto the changing composition of the Indian diaspora in New Zealand, where trans-world and transmigration patterns of migration are reflecting the impact of globalization. I see this novel as a new kind of Kiwi Indian novel, one that contributes to the new frameworks of representation provided by South Asian and Asian cultural production that is currently intersecting and expanding the national imaginary with global transnational perspectives. Like all diaspora novels, Chakraborti's shows the double perspectives of the migration experience, remembering the homeland in India, relocating in the host land of New Zealand. And I approach it through a transcultural, transnational lens because of the complexity of its relocation process. These frames acknowledge the ambiguity of identities shaped by multiple cultural experiences for present-day migrants who travel back and forth, experiencing not so much the pool of conflicting loyalties, as used to be the case in pre-global days, but the challenges of plural, intersecting realities that require balancing and relativizing in order to accommodate various types of difference. Transculturalism is about the fuzziness of the borders between cultures and the way they overlap and enmesh. And I will identify narrative techniques that problematize issues of perception and cognitive understanding, as hinted in the title, The Man Who Would Not See, and the unexpected discoveries that arise in the confusing space of doubled and contested locations. The transnational and transcultural come together as an appropriate framework for investigating this novel about living in today's India diaspora in New Zealand, Aotearoa. I'll start with some background about the Indian diaspora and then talk a little about theories of transculturalism and then make a brief comparison with another Indian Kiwi novel published in 2005 to indicate the changes that have happened in the last 15 years. So the Indian diaspora in New Zealand was very slow moving in the 20th century, but an upsurge in South Asian migrants occurred in the late 80s with new legislation that opened up the labour market to the global economy, with a focus on skill-based immigration. The demand for professional and highly educated migrants following the removal of barriers of race and origin led to a doubling of Indians in the decades between 1991 and 2001, leading to media claims of Asian immigration as what was called an invasion, INV, Asian. But that only lasted a couple of years. Asian migrants, of which Chinese and Indian are the two largest groups, are now the biggest migrant population and today comprise 15.1% of the total population of about 5 million. So they've been vital to create a multicultural Aotea New Zealand, which also contains an indigenous population of Maori of about 16.5%. So you can see that the migrant population is now almost the same size as the indigenous population in New Zealand, Aotearoa. As I said, the Indian is now one of the fastest growing diasporas, and it's expanded and diversified internally through ethnic affiliations and multiple cultural heritages. The descendants are New Zealand Indians, Indo-New Zealanders, Kiwi Indians, Indo-Fijians or Fijian-born Indians. And they're recognized intersectionally in terms of religion, whether Muslim, Christian, Hindu, language, Punjabi, Hindi, Gujarati, gender diversity. I should mention women. Indian women hold professional positions and are educated, and age. Double the number of Indian students this century means there is a different demographic than previously. The Indian South Asian diaspora is in terms of its cultural practices, becoming a visible minority due to events in the public sphere, such as the Diwali festivals that feature Bollywood dance and Bhangra performance, alongside classical, folk, and tribal dance and music. Syncretic types of Kiwi Indian cultural production and performance, dance and theatre often have a global orientation. For example, the Indian Ink Theatre Company, whose plays are widely acclaimed both at home and overseas at the Edinburgh Festival. This is how the Indian diaspora has made its biggest cultural impact. By contrast, the hybrid literary output of these migrant communities is still in a fledgling state, but gaining national exposure. It's only in the last 2 decades that such an entity as the New Zealand Indian novel or the Kiwi Indian novel has begun to appear. So I'm now moving on to talk about what I see as a predecessor to The Man Who Would Not See, a novel published 13 years ago, published 13 years earlier, I should say, for its parallels and differences, to show how the scale and representing the fictional world of the migrant writer has changed during this time. So Malika Krishnamurti published 6 Yards of Silk in 2005. And in this writing of a first-generation South Asian migrant, issues like racial discrimination, home and belonging, and the trajectories of memory are all filtered through this narrative about the problematic processes of relocation. The focus in Malika Krishnamurti's novel is on a 35-year-old woman, Sharmila, who has migrated to New Zealand from South India as a young child with her parents and her younger brother. She's married a Kiwi man and has 3 children, but the novel is about her crisis of dislocation, loss, and self-doubt, triggered by the disappearance of her brother. No one knows where he is, his complete invisibility. And she is in a state of withdrawal and self-alienation. This is partly mitigated by the arrival of her aunt from South India, who reinforces her knowledge of her Indian heritage, her religion, food, memories of relatives, and of her childhood there, as she struggles with the conflicting identity structures between her parents' traditionalism and the demands of New Zealand society, in which she often feels an alien. The novel presents contrasting gendered responses to the migrant condition. Her brother, by contrast, is overwhelmed by the contradictions between his Indianness and New Zealand relocation. He can't find any suitable mode of living, and we find out at the end of the novel that, in fact, he has committed suicide right at the very beginning, while Sharmila eventually recovers and gains a new sense of balance and additional belonging as she mourns her brother's death. The brother's feelings and thoughts are recounted through a disconnected, disembodied voice. He plays no part in the present day action other than by how he affects his sister by his absence. So the focus remains on her state of mind in the present day. These narrative strands are about the struggle with culture, tradition, and subjectivity that comes with different cultural signifying systems, and the migrants' estrangement, which affects their agency. Like other immigrant fictions, it demonstrates resistance to the process of assimilation and shows that living in an in-between space consists of ongoing processes of readjustment. Now I move on to Rajorshi Chakraborti's novel. I'll just briefly introduce this. Okay, these are the 2 novels that I'm discussing. And in addition, I've showing you an image of a recent book on Asian voices. It's an anthology of stories and poetry that came out last year. And really, this is the very first anthology of its type, which goes to show how very new and very emerging this tradition is. Hardly yet able to be called a tradition, but as I'm going to show, I believe that Chakraborti is laying down some patterns that might be followed up in later work. The man who would not see represents another phase or type of migrant experience of imperfect assimilation to that covered by 6 Yards of Silk. Its migrant protagonist is an adult and well-travelled. He had migrated from India, first to Scotland as a postgraduate student, then after marrying a Kiwi woman he met at the university there, he migrates with her to Wellington. They're middle-class, educated, mobile, cosmopolitan. She is a university lecturer, and Abbe, the protagonist, is the author of 5 novels and a house husband who looks after their 4-year-old daughter. Now, this is very similar to the lifestyle of the author Chakraborti himself. But more to the point, it's representative of the new type of Indian migrant who began coming to New Zealand in the early 90s and has the same socioeconomic status and professional standing. I should say that the implication of sightlessness in the title, of not seeing, refers to the amnesia that can occur in diaspora. At the level of plot, this involves international travel. The protagonist's brother, Ashim, visits from Hazaribagh in India to Abbe, his half-brother in Wellington. And then later, Abbe, the hero, returns to India for a surprise visit to Ashim. This is because fraternal friction has developed when Ashim accused Abbe of ignoring him both in the present and in the past. But at the meta level, blindness or not seeing or a blurred reality is all associated with the novelist's manipulation of reality, and so with the fiction-making process. I see that Ashim is partly the protagonist's alter ego as author. Abbe, in turn, exploits his life and what happens to both of them for fictional ends. Their struggle involving the manipulation of reality is played out in the context of globalized modernity, the fragmentation of worldviews in diaspora, the virtual reality of mobile technologies, and the unpredictability of memory. So the transmigratory migrant lifestyle demarcates a shift in the handling of fictional space from the binary national-based paradigm based on cultural difference and reinforced by conflict between traditional and cultural values, different types of cultural values, as found in 6 Yards of Silk, to a more transnational orientation. Familiar literary concepts and tropes of diaspora writing that appear in the earlier novel, identity struggle, fragmented memory, revisions of home and belonging, liminal position, in fact, do reappear in The Man Who Would Not See, but in revised and reconfigured form. The fusions and disjunctions between different spaces and time frames are now represented through narrative modes that involve self-questioning and reflexivity, in which reality is doubted. Cultural borders are seen as fuzzy and indeterminate. The nation state is an ambivalent container of culture, and the text itself is part of a mobile literary system of production. All this makes a novel productive of analysis as a transcultural one. Now, a little bit about transculturalism, which I'm treating as a category of inquiry. It is a post or supranational understanding of culture that first came to prominence in the work of the Cuban theorist Fernández Ortiz in the 1940s, who argued that transformative interactions between cultures was a way of linking nations of uneven powers. These were revitalized in the work of the German critic Wolfgang Welsch in the early 90s. Welsch dispensed with models of cultural hierarchies and dichotomies, or of cultures as self-contained entities and linked to a single state, seeing them instead as permeable, quote, enmeshed webs of cultural relations that extend beyond the nation state and involving cultural processes that are entangled, conflictual, and fractured. In more recent work, or more recent criticism, Such concepts have been consolidated in theories and theorizings of transculturalism to describe modes of identity formation within cultural interfaces, replacing monocultural or multicultural concepts, now considered as insufficient to describe present global conditions. This rethinking has reframed critical approaches to literary modes concerned with migration, transnationalism, and the local global intersection. For Frank Schulze-Engler, transculturalism, when used of realities and fictions, is principally a heuristic category of inquiry. And I argue that as The Man Who Would Not See seeks to reflect precisely these agonistic cultural processes, both in its external locations and in the struggle about reality, where it is, where does it lie, the novel can be examined through this lens. Both in structure and narratology, it reflects and refracts the interdependence of New Zealand Indian cultures, enhanced mobility, the loss of national distinctions, and ruptured identities, while its strategies of self-reflexivity and doubt, of metafiction and narrative unreliability, adapted from earlier fictional traditions of writers like Lawrence Sterne, Cervantes, Pynchon, and Samuel Beckett, are built into new, overlapping spaces and storylines. These result in multiply inflected reconfigurations of home and belonging for both brothers in the novel, both Abe and his half-brother Ashim. Both cultural differences and commonalities are recognized, and Abe has to discover the foreigner within himself, in order to be able to comprehend others. Of course, this foreigner is the brother who accuses him of avoidance. For in the words of Wolfgang Welsch, nothing is absolutely foreign. Transculturality requires, quote, attentiveness to what might be common and connective whenever we encounter things foreign. And it's in this phase of the Migrant novel, it's argued, that readers also become involved in a transcultural practice based on cross-cultural encounters and are required or invited to question and rethink their own cultural positioning. In The Man Who Would Not See, as I will argue in my analysis, cognitive uncertainty is a thematic from the very beginning, causing a disordered subjectivity on the part of Abe, the protagonist, so that narrative unreliability comes to represent transculturality at a mimetic level. Okay. So the psychic disorientation and motives of confusion and blindness that blur familiar boundaries and erase distinctions are represented in The Man Who Would Not See through human disorder, interrupted plans, loss of direction, new travel arrangements, all loosely connected with the novel's guiding trope of a blindness about reality. On Ashim's visit to Abe in Wellington, the brothers discuss the breakup of their family home in India decades earlier in 1988. They became lost one evening near Howrah Station in Calcutta when Ashim, the older by about 12 years, was attempting to find the house in which he'd lived before the boy's father divorced Ashim's mother and married Abe's mother. In other words, before Abe was born. They were blamed by their father for causing distress by being lost and staying out all night. Their father, Baba, peremptorily separated his 3 offspring, sending Ashim and his sister Didi, children of his first wife, to Hazaribagh, while Abe, the younger son of the second marriage, remained in the family home in Calcutta. A truly unfair and hasty move on the father's part. In depicting this boyhood trauma as a form of sibling rivalry for their father's attention, as he now sees it, Ashim accuses Abe of not defending him and his actions to Baba when they were children, saying, because having your house and your father back all to yourself was just too tempting. And he accuses him of blindly ignoring him after he'd been cast out of the family home. Abbey, despite his incredulity and outrage at this accusation so many years later, indulges in an odyssey of guilt. The sense that the secure signposts of the past are unravelling and that present-day realities are blurred henceforth dominates, as Abbey begins to distrust his perceptions and assumes the guise of unreliability. Although there's a hint that suspicion and guilt become creative springboards as well. Asim piles on the pressure and tells Abbey that their sister Didi, whom Abbey had not seen since a child, has disappeared and committed suicide. This is later revealed as a lie. In response, Abbey moves out of his family home in Wellington, away from his wife and child, rents a flat nearby, and embarks on a novel about that branch of the family he's ignored for 20 years. After Asim returns to India, Abbey, still feeling he's been manipulated, makes a surprise visit to Hazaribagh to meet his brother and his extended family and allay his suspicions over whether Asim is telling the truth or not. Abbey's inner turbulence, the mixing of self-doubt with creativity as he embarks on a new novel, is represented through key features of the transcultural novel. The destabilization of his life is a version of the bizarre situation in which an uncertain reality is represented. Like other transcultural novels, Chakraborti uses both a polyphonic narrative technique and a self-conscious metafictional narrative. Abbey and his wife Lena, as alternating first-person narrators with intersecting yet colliding points of view, speculate on the disconcerting vectors of alterity and epistemological difference that Asim represents. His concern for the underdog, they notice, in supporting a Muslim woman who's being persecuted on a bus, although he doesn't mix with Muslims socially. His unexplained disappearance while staying with them as their guest and sharing confidences with their elderly Indian friend and neighbour in Wellington. His favouring of superstitious pre-European rites, which Abbey labels as voodoo and black magic. But they react differently to Asim's insistence that Abbey's privileged lifestyle, quote, airbrushed of misfortune, is unfairly due to his early good fortune at remaining in the family home in Calcutta, a claim that shocks Lena, Abbey's wife. The different narrative voices, including Asim's, multiply doubt and confusion. Lena, a stranger to the brothers' argument, with limited access to their exchange, shifts in her loyalty. A confidant of her husband and aware of his confused state, she intervenes and says that he must pay for the penance for the rosiness of his life. Here she seems to be echoing Asim's position, but later she decides that Asim is bitter and full of poison and tells Abbey his brother is cutting you off from your family. Abbey's personal crisis involves a slippery overlap with his brother's identity, and it continues as he embarks on, quote, an atonement plan and self-reform, unquote, in order to overcome the, quote, incurable naivety and unbelievable blindness of which Asim accuses him. But both angles are there to confuse the reader, who finds it difficult to empathize with either. Rather, on the one hand, self-doubt has become lodged into the world of the text because of Asim's childish geographical error in 1988 and his subjective sense of injustice that arises from his false memory, aged 12, of where the original house was. On the other hand, I think he would have been about 15. On the other hand, there's an extravagantly confessional element in Abbey's self-accusation of the art of ignoring due to the family habit of looking away after his siblings were cast out, and in choosing smoothness, that is, living in the West, writing and being financially supported by his wife. This is a plot built on explicit lies, evasion, and overreaction. Narrative unreliability is assumed on the part of the reader, but this is true of fiction's This is true of fictional representations of fallibility in general, and in many recent novels which emphasize subjectivity, character unreliability is accepted as a social norm. It's reliability that's seen as an impossibility in the contemporary novel. However, the transcultural diaspora novel differs from others in that the lapses in reality are caused by transnational movement, the elision of characters, and the gaps and ellipses in memory. Also, I think, by the fluidity of movement in a global era of technological communication. Both brothers are fallible or wrong in different ways. Abe misinterprets Ashim's version of reality, then finally realizes that this version is a mere tactic. His brother is lying about the truth, such as the sister's death, and he's parading a sense of injustice, which he probably doesn't feel that strongly now, in order to lure him back to India. On the other hand, Abe or Chakraborti, who's pulling the strings, is in turn playing games with the reader about his protagonist's motives in returning to India. How can we be sure ourselves that what he says is true? As Abe crosses national, cultural, and social boundaries in writing a novel and in the return to India, the fraternal friction plot is overlaid by the act of storytelling, and different narrative devices draw attention to the constructedness of the text. Ashim's revelation that he'd lied about their sister being dead in order to offer Abe, quote, an irresistible real-life plot twist to see what you would do with it, is denounced by his brother as the most absurd of bluffs, quote. And then Ashim is imaged by Abe as Machiavellian, cagey, slippery, and downright untrustworthy, with intertextual allusions to Patricia Highsmith's Tom Ripley, with his, quote, cold-blooded talent at manipulating others, and as analogous to, a, quote, a monster egotist and a psychopath. Yet Abe introduces his own storytelling tropes in fictionalizing the surprise visit to India, seeing it as a, quote, breaking story, and as allowing him to participate in, quote, Ashim's unbelievable performance, a reality show, saying, quote, I was in it for nothing more than the chance of a sensational book in which his brother's family would feature. Narrative unreliability, therefore, also foregrounds Abe's self-reflexive response to Ashim, as the latter's, quote, reality, his life in Hazaribagh, is used to create fiction, and Ashim becomes associated with Abe's authorial role, as if an alter ego in a metafictional dimension or spiral. The constructedness of the world of the text emphasizes their similarities as creators and inventors, as Abe now sees, quote, the pattern of being manipulated, asking, is it entirely any misconception that Ashim selects, frames, edits what I see? His accolade to his brother, that Ashim, quote, is the conductor of people and an artist far greater than he would ever be, further blurs their identities around the issues of authorial manipulation and control. Abe's new fiction, the novel he's now writing as he goes to India, justified as wishing to memorialize a fictitiously dead sister and, quote, atone for his past omissions, helps deconstruct his earlier self-imposed victim image of mental disturbance and disoriented reality, tropes associated with Ashim's dissenting behavior. But this maneuver itself can also be read as an authorial strategy on the part of Abe, and behind him, Chakraborti. I see the two as mirroring each other, and a step to the next stage. the revelations that occur on the trip to India. Furthermore, if the novel's fictive space is examined in relation to its circumstances of production, and if the correlations between Abbe, the author character, and Chakraborti, his creator, is taken into account, then narrative unreliability, with its currency in fiction that has a global slant, might also be read as one way out of a career impasse. This is summed up by Abbe's complaint about his out-of-print novels and his diasporic feeling of being cut off from my professional dreams because his work is not local enough for the New Zealand market, and he's too remote from India, where it would have greater currency, to be published there. In this way, he's responding to a new need for new fictional imaginations to reach new audiences. As Rebecca Walkowitz explains, writers who've belonged or who continue to belong to more than one nation, region, or state, and who now participate in a literary system that is different from the system in which they were born, educated, or first published, may not fit comfortably into any system. In this thematic of the stalled literary career, the novel touches on the question of the marketing of the diaspora novel. Abbe lacks access to, quote, a literary system that relies on networks of publishing and distribution that are international, if not global, according to Walkowitz. His books are published in New Zealand. He has not acquired Indian co-publishers. His work has not entered the global marketplace. His thwarted ambition as a Kiwi Indian writer, therefore, because remember he's already written 5 novels, imply that the problematic perception of reality in The Man Who Would Not See, however this is represented, is in fact part of an authorial maneuver to globalize and internationalize his writing. To this end, Abbe reshapes his discourse of blame and guilt, blame of his brother, guilt at his own actions, and reframes his brother from being a monster of egotism and a cold-blooded psychopath into a lifesaver. Quote, the flawed messenger who roused me to this journey, for he has given him, quote, the subject for my dream book, the one that promised to be the making of me. That is a transcultural text designed to appeal to diverse readerships and global markets. By introducing unreliability as a catalyst for the processes of fiction, he ambitiously expands his fictional and geographical scope and reinvents the old world, the old home world of India that he knew, as a new world of discovery. Nevertheless, the issues of publication in overseas markets he raises are a legacy of concerns among earlier New Zealand writers of the 20th century about the country's remoteness from northern hubs of cultural power that had limited their access to overseas markets. Chakraborti, through his character Abbe, restates this problem within the frame of a global culture on behalf of other hyphenated diaspora writers who find that their work is not Kiwi enough to do well on the local market, and their limited access to cosmopolitan centres reduces opportunities for wider circulation. The Jekyll and Hyde dualism between the brothers is resolved in Hazaribagh, however, with reference to the novel's unstated premise that a broken home, due to the father's arbitrary decision to separate the boys, in which children come to bear the burden of blame that's really the adult's responsibility, can lead to a fragmented and dislocated reality. Ashim's irrational attitudes and seemingly unjustifiable accusations in Wellington, when he's visiting there, are reinterpreted in the Indian context, where Abbe sees his brother differently through his homemaking practices. He's surprised by Ashim's prosperity, which he concealed when in Wellington, and his wife Mushimi's successful garden business, and their care of the missing sister's children. And he realizes he's underestimated him. Furthermore, India comes to represent for Abe a cluster of values that he'd previously ignored. A, quote, a primeval and psychological rootedness, perhaps even stability, authenticity, and spirituality, unquote. His selection processes sharpen. For example, he embraces the authenticity of his nephew, Jappy, who can perform without faking it. And he has a sudden change of mind about consulting the tantric astrologer he visits with Ashim. Recalling his earlier skepticism about such practices, he decides not to go down that path. In the native domestic environment, Abe notes that the exiled half of the family, that's Ashim and his family, the half that was sent off to Hazarabad by his father, all live in the rooted way. The concept of home becomes more relational in this transnational relocation, with a discovery of family dynamics and communality that his privileged life had lacked until now. His acceptance of Ashim and Mushimi involves acknowledging, quote, the blindness and laziness and fear and guilt that prevented him from becoming part of their world years earlier. He now understands blindness or amnesia is a mode of being, epitomized by lifestyle choices such as living diasporically, as well as a mode of perception. As Abe overcomes his obtuseness about being uprooted from his Indian family and his lack of empathy with Ashim when he was cast out of the family home in 1988. But anyway, these psychosocial effects of the diaspora's subject return to the homeland apparently are often beneficial in just these ways. For according to Christine Vaught Williams, the homeland return consists of, quote, a new form of self-perception through a merging of selected cultural aspects whereby lost or non-existent abilities and convictions, and thus a sense of balance, can be regained. The family reunion in the conclusion, involving Abe's realignment of individual, family, and national boundaries, illustrate, quote, the increasingly connected life worlds of the transcultural novel. In making the transition from an uprooted Kiwi Indian identity to a multi-locatedness, Abe confirms the value of extended familial ties and justifies writing his current novel about his entanglement with Ashim and the enmeshing of Kiwi-India cultures. This transcultural conception of home is expressed in his wife Lena's email sent to him as he departs from India en route to Wellington. She writes, "Come home. Next time, we're all going home together to Hazarabad." Conclusion. In the current decolonial climate of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the new frameworks of representation provided by Asian and South Asian cultural production show multiple ethnicities and subject positions as intersecting with the dominant framework of biculturalism. Pākehā, the white settler norm, and the indigenous tangata whenua, the Maori, that's what constitutes biculturalism, against which migrant communities continued to be judged. The man who would not see pushes into globally inflected territory in its family confrontation and tropes of disturbance. Gaps in memory, loss of cognitive power, overlapping identities, and a blurring of differences, all requiring some renegotiations of cultural borders. In the novel's cathartic, effective conclusion, Abe's confusions about belonging are resolved in his experience of the home space as plural, multi-layered, and fluidly identifiable both within and beyond the nation. To this extent, the novel's respatializing of world spheres constitutes an intervention into familiar collectivities in New Zealand and an affirmation of alternative solidarities in India. In this sense, it provides a decentered image of the nation and accords a new dynamic to the transcultural imaginary. The Man Who Would Not See, then, can be read as metonymic of the multiplying and expanding national, transnational imaginaries of Aotearoa, New Zealand. The fictional imaginings of alternative homeworlds and modernities, with distinctive practices and lifestyles in the work of other South Asian writers, like the international best-selling Fijian Indian Nalini Singh, writer of paranormal romance, fantasy and science fiction, the Malaysian Tamil Pillai Sugu, and others represented in a 2021 anthology of 75 new Asian voices from Aotearoa, New Zealand, suggest the potential of this writing to redraw the boundaries of national culture and add to the current globalization of New Zealand writing. For although, quote, bicultural Aotea New Zealand reflects the nation's post-colonial repositioning, this binary bicultural framework disguises its complex ethnic diversity, which is opening up the national space to multiple global imaginaries. Both The Man Who Would Not See, 6 Yards of Silk, and other South Asian cultural productions, in representing experiences of dislocation, relocation, and transnationalism, establish a new shape and direction for the New Zealand national identity, and maybe, in time, for the Indian diasporic one as well. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, ma'am. Dear participants, the session is open for questions. If you have any, you may type it in the chat box.
I should say that the interest in the transcultural novel is very prominent in Europe, but less so in this part of the world. And I think that it's a very productive lens through which to examine emerging migrant fiction, which is finding its shape and its identity. And I've already examined another novel by a Sri Lankan writer, which is a refugee novel. So thank you for this question, Miss Zen. Indeed, a lot has changed. I don't know Bhati Mukherjee's contribution. I'm not sure when that was written, but I'll try and find out more about it. So I applied the transcultural lens to a refugee novel about a Sri Lankan refugee who came to New Zealand. And that was quite a challenge, because the general thinking about the transcultural novel, as you've probably worked out from what I've told you tonight about The Man Who Would Not See, is that this is a kind of fiction that belongs to elites, people who've got the money to travel, who've got the education and the skills to move cosmopolitan-like around the world and can adapt to, or try and adapt, move in and out of different cultural spheres. And it's possible to see similar types of mobility and interaction on the part of other types of social groupings, like refugees, although it's not in quite the same mode of travel that you find with the transcultural novel, which is more about crossing national and geographical borders beyond the nation. However, I think that transculturalism can also be a form of mind travel, and it can work with memory and the reinvigoration of the present by rethinking and reworking negative memories of the past into more positive, affirmative ones that assist with relocation in the present. So are there any more questions or comments? You'd be surprised at how little Indian Kiwi writing there is. In the book of 75 Asian Voices, many of them are Chinese. They're from the Philippines, they're from Sri Lanka, they're from Malaysia. Is this novel different in any way from other Yes, it is. And in my reading, the difference comes with the deliberate blurring of the boundaries between nations and cultures. Other transnational works might have sharper edges and define the differences more clearly, whereas this one shows that what is seen as a difference is in fact blurring and merging and requires acceptance as something that can be familiarized and adapted to. It's not quite the same as assimilation, but it's a balancing, as I said early in the paper. It's a relationality or relativizing of difference. And I don't think other transnational works do this in quite the same way. There's perhaps, I think, more of the cosmopolitan voice in the transcultural novel, and that's an aspect that I didn't explore very fully in this paper, but I think has been talked about more by other critics. Does that answer your question? Of course, in many ways, the transcultural novel is just using the same tricks and tropes that you find in the postmodern novel, with ideas of playing with the reader, of the fight over authorial control. J.M. Coetzee does this in his novel Slow Man, and in his novels about Elizabeth Costello, who's a kind of alter ego for him. I see that Chakraborti is perhaps working in that same tradition. It's not quite as pronounced as in Coetzee, and it's not quite as deliberate, but there are elements of elision between the two brothers on the grounds of their ability to manipulate reality. It's not quite a competition, but it is about a sort of what I call an enmeshment and entanglement that is confusing. And that's the heart of the transcultural novel. You go through this period of confusion and uncertainty and self-questioning and doubt, and you lose reference points. And then with luck and the right kinds of input and forensic power, you unravel this confusion and recover a sense of balance and proportion and begin to see that reality has changed and you've reconfigured it. You've got different reference points, more balances, different sort of ways of seeing one thing in terms of another, of seeing connections, better forms of connectivity. It happens in 6 Yards of Silk, the novel by Malika Krishnamurti, but not in such a sophisticated narrative way and not in such a pronounced way of confusion between different realities. More in her novel is the sense of loss, conflict, opposition, and irresolvable distance, which leads her to become much more, I think, a Kiwi in New Zealand, whereas Chakraborti is showing that an Indian can be can return to his own homeland and retain and discover elements of his Indianness that allows him to reconcile with India much more, and to then analyze or understand his New Zealand locatedness in a richer way, a better way. But of course, he didn't have the sense of major dislocation at the beginning that the candidate, the heroine of 6 Yards of Silk had. He had a smooth life, as he says. Everything had worked out for him. He didn't have that angst that she has because he was already adjusted to being a diasporic life, having a diasporic lifestyle. He'd been traveling and moving into different cultures for many years before he came to New Zealand as a student in Scotland. In this sense, very much like Chakraborti himself, who studied in Canada and England before he came to New Zealand and is, I believe, married to a New Zealand wife.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And now I would like to invite convener of IFDP, Dr. Arina Nazni, to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Vanya. As we express our gratitude, we must never forget the highest appreciation is not to utter words, but to live by them. And ma'am, we really live the moment with you. I feel honored and privileged to get the opportunity to propose a vote of thanks for such a philosophical session. I, Dr. Aina Nazneen, on the behalf of the head of the department, Dr. Hafiz Mohammad Arif Nadvi, co-convener, Ms. Vanya Srivastav, coordinator of Integral Learning Initiative, Mr. Arif Usmani, and the organizing committee of the Department of Languages, Integral University, I convey deep regards and hearty thanks to our eminent speaker, Emerita Professor of English and Post-Colonial Studies at the University of Northampton and visiting professor of the Birmingham Institute of Media and English, Birmingham City University, United Kingdom. Ma'am, your stimulating ideas on the topic, a transcultural reading of Kiwi Indian novel, The Man Who Would Not See 2018 by Rajorshi Chakraborti, a captivating novel set in India and New Zealand, canvassing the past and present, is really remarkable. Ma'am, you have beautifully examined the unhealable rift of the self separation and illustrated the conflicting voices to produce another rich element to the men who would never see. For these aspects, you expanded concept of migration beyond the physical and environmental to the philosophical, familial, and spiritual. Ma'am, you have covered a vast topic that would open a new dimension in learning and understanding literature. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Honorable Chancellor, Professor S.W. Akhtar, Pro Chancellor Dr. Syed Nadeem Akhtar, and Vice Chancellor Professor Javed Musarras sir for providing us with the rostrum for organizing this online international faculty development program. I lack words to appreciate our participants who set the wheels rolling day by day with their attentiveness and enthusiasm to this lecture. They share our responsibility for the effective running of the sessions. Through this platform, I want to express my sincere gratitude to each and everyone who cooperated with the accomplishment of this task. We have been fortunate enough to be backed by a team of motivated and dedicated colleagues. Once again, thank you, ma'am, for your cooperation and support that you excel for this IFDP. Thank you, ma'am. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. It's been a huge pleasure and privilege to address you all, and I've really enjoyed the occasion and the opportunity to share my ideas with you. I do hope that your event goes well. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Indeed, ma'am, we are highly enlightened with this session. And it is said that knowledge is not having and resting, but growing and becoming. So today's session has aptly justified the above statement by introducing us to a new dimension of looking at socio-cultural phenomena of literature. I also expect our participants to take this baton of knowledge further through the assignments we update on Integral Learning Initiative, that is ILI. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll update you for tomorrow's sessions on WhatsApp group. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Vanya. Goodbye.
Goodbye, ma'am. Thank you.